Hey, welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and in this video, we're going to be covering presuppositional apologetics applied to Hinduism. As you guys have been following my channel for quite some time, you will know that I am very much interested in applying the biblical approach to apologetics to literally every conceivable topic. It is my conviction that because the Bible teaches a particular apologetic methodology, and that we're called to always be ready to give a reason for the hope that's within us, that approach that's laid out in Scripture can be applied to literally every single point of opposition that we can find out there in the world. And so I invite you guys, as if you're a Christian, you're following this channel and you're learning from the content, I invite you to equip yourself to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ, even the thoughts of the unbeliever. Now, on this particular topic, Hinduism, this is not a topic that I focused a lot on. I think I have an article on my blog, revealedapologetics.com. And I think I cover Hinduism there. But what inspired this particular video is that I just got back from a conference. I was speaking up in Pennsylvania at the No Other Name conference. And this was one of the conferences that I was promoting on the channel and just letting folks know that it was happening around this time. I was speaking alongside Pastor Jeff Durbin, and the conference was put on by Future of Christendom. So real quick, before I get into the chunk of this video, the content of this video, I'd like to thank Chris Hume, who did an excellent job in the debate, which was kind of the cherry on the top of the conference. After we went through all of the different sessions and so forth, there was a debate that kind of capped off the event. And Chris Hume, I thought, did a wonderful job illustrating all of the various points that were discussed in the different sessions that emphasize some kind of presuppositional application. So excellent job, Chris Hume. And I'd like to thank Luke Saint, who was a blessing to get to know as well. And for all those who put on the conference, thank you so much for inviting me out. Had a great time meeting everyone, folks who supported the channel, people from all over the country. And it was a great joy to be able to have dinner with Pastor Jeff and Carmen and Christine. We had a great time of fellowship, talking about martial arts. That was really cool, talking to Pastor Jeff. We are very similar. When I grew up watching martial arts movies and things like that. So we had a fun time talking about those things. And so it was a great blessing, but glad to be back. And one of the tasks that I was given at this conference was to speak on the topic of Hinduism. And it was really, really hard. The session went fine, but I had to talk about Hinduism, and I literally had 18 minutes. They wanted to do kind of this TED Talk style, covering different topics, and they were great. I mean, they were very informative. All the different speakers brought some really interesting points, but to talk about Hinduism in 18 minutes is really, really hard. So I tried my best to have fun with it. Hopefully those who were listening in were blessed by the talk that I gave there. Now, in terms of offering an apologetic critique of Hinduism, I think we need to understand what Hinduism actually is. And I've got to be honest, it is a difficult and very nuanced topic if you're not familiar with kind of Eastern lines of thinking. Hinduism historically has been considered one of the most, ancient, complex, diverse religious systems in the world. And it's often referred to as the oldest living religion, with roots that stretch as far back as, 3,000 years or possibly even more. And so it's old, it is diverse, it is hard to nail down. It really depends on who you're speaking with and what tradition that particular person is coming from. And it is interesting because when people hear of Hinduism, they typically associate Hinduism with polytheism, which, with respect to Hinduism, it's often posited that it is believed that there are over 330 million gods. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about that in just a moment, but when I'm teaching worldviews and different religious perspectives to my students, when I teach at the Christian private school that I teach, I often write two religions on the board, and I ask my students, which do you think is more polytheistic? And I would have Hinduism and Mormonism. And most people would choose Hinduism because they typically associate Hinduism with that 330 million gods. But of course, the right answer would be, what do you think? I'll give you a few seconds there. So yeah, so it's Mormonism, right? So Mormonism posits an infinite regression of gods. You can become a god. There's an infinite number of gods potentially in Mormonism, whereas in Hinduism, there's kind of a finite number of these gods with some qualifications. So Again, it's very important to understand that what underpins Hinduism at the worldview level are categories of what we might call pantheism, or versions of Hinduism can hold to the view known as panentheism. So pantheism, pantheism, all is God, God is all. Panentheism, all is within God. You have different variations of that. But the acknowledgement of 330 million deities must be understood within the backdrop of its metaphysical monism, this idea that all is ultimately one. So these 330 million gods are just different manifestations of the one. We'll kind of talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But it's really, really important that when you're speaking to Hindus, that you are able to differentiate the different kinds of Hindu traditions. And this is really going to be played out in the questions you ask. You need to learn to ask questions. What do you believe? What tradition are you from? What do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? It's very, very important to do that, especially when you're trying to do intellectual reconnaissance of what someone believes. People don't wear their beliefs on their shirt, right? There's not going to be a t-shirt that a Hindu is going to be wearing and is going to give you all of the details of what they believe. So given its nuance, its complexity, its antiquity, what I want to do here is be very broad, but give a general overview so that hopefully you get an overall flavor of what Hinduism is all about. Now, when I explore religious perspectives, I always come at it from that worldview perspective. You guys know this is a lot of, this is a lot of what I like to do. And primarily because it's easy for me to categorize in terms of worldview. When I take beliefs within a religious system and I examine them piece by piece, it can get very complicated very quickly. So I think in terms of those worldview foundations that we've discussed on this channel, the foundations that make up every philosophical perspective, every worldview perspective, and those are the categories of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And I tend to think of those three categories, those three worldview categories, as kind of like buckets. So that when I ask the unbeliever questions and they tell me a little bit about their view, I'm able to put what they say in these kind of three buckets and then kind of have a more organized way of understanding what they're talking about. So Hinduism is no different. Whether I'm talking to a Muslim, I'm going to have those three buckets. If I'm talking to a Mormon, I'm going to have those three buckets. If I'm talking to like a new age kind of person, I'm going to have those three buckets. And it helps me kind of organize what is the nature of their worldview? What are they asserting from their own perspective? Let me take a quick break and grab my cup of coffee. Dr. Greg Bahnsen was a renowned Christian apologist, philosopher, and seminary professor, and his life's work is now at your fingertips with Bahnsen U. Bahnsen U aims to bring seminary-level education to every Christian anytime, anywhere, absolutely free. Gain access to over 140 courses covering theology, apologetics, eschatology, and law, featuring sermons, seminary lectures, and more from the legendary Dr. Greg Bahnsen. Now, if you sign up today at apologiastudios.com and join over 13,000 users already benefiting from this incredible resource, you will not regret it. And soon, they're expanding with Bahnsen U Plus and Bahnsen U Live, bringing fresh supplemental learning and real-time engagement. Again, go to apologiastudios.com and start your journey today. All right. You guys know me with the coffee, right? Coffee and Jesus, not in that order, I always say. Okay, so in terms of worldview, what I want to talk a little bit about is Hinduism at the metaphysical level. So every worldview, whether it's a religious worldview or a secular perspective, has what we might call metaphysical categories. And that's just a fancy way of saying that every worldview has an answer to the following question. And again, if you follow the channel, you're going to be familiar with this, but it's important to kind of review, okay? Every worldview within the category of their metaphysic, their theory of reality, is going to answer the following question: what is ultimately real? What's the stuff reality is made of? What lies at the bottom of everything? Now, for the Christian, it might be helpful to kind of think in terms of comparison here from the Christian, ultimate reality for us is personal, right? The metaphysical foundation of all reality is the triune God who exists eternally. He exists apart from his creation. This is key in understanding properly a Christian metaphysic. We make a real, what we call creator-creature distinction. But in Hinduism, the answer to that question is actually very different. What is at base fundamentally real? What is the metaphysical situation for the Hindu? Okay, they're going to answer that in a very different way. And that difference, I think, makes all the difference in the world in terms of comparing and contrasting worldviews. And so at the core of Hindu, at least in terms of their metaphysics, is something we might call metaphysical monism. Metaphysical monism. And I'll try my best to talk slowly if you're watching this and you're taking notes, okay, if you want to get the terminology down. The Hindu metaphysic could be understood in terms of what we call a metaphysical monism. And that's the belief that all is at base one. Okay, monism, mono, okay? I'm going to face off with this guy, mano y mano, right? One-on-one, okay? Metaphysical monism is the belief that fundamentally all is one. And on such a perspective, a metaphysical view, there are ultimately no distinctions, okay? There is no creator and creation, no real separation between the self and the divine, no true, we might say, individuality that exists independently. So from this perspective, everything is part of one reality. And this is the philosophical backdrop of much of Hindu thought. Again, with nuance, because it really is going to depend on who you're speaking with, but this is a very important feature of a wide variety of Hindu perspectives. Now, a specific form of metaphysical monism, okay, so if I were to take like metaphysics from if we take a worldview at the most broadest perspective, okay, in terms of metaphysics, the broad worldview category of monism, of Hinduism would be monism, of which a specific form of metaphysical monism, specifically in Hinduism, is what we call pantheism. And that's the idea that God is everything and everything is God. The tree is God, you are God, the river, the cow, the cloud, or whatever that you want to, anything you want to point to, they all are just different expressions, of the same divine essence. And so while Hinduism may appear, and this is what I mentioned before with the 330 million gods, Hinduism may appear to embrace polytheism with all of the different gods. And I don't know all the names of them. I can't even pronounce many of the names. That's kind of the biggest challenge in studying Hinduism. But while many people appear to embrace the existence of all these different gods, what you need to know at a worldview level, at a metaphysical level, underneath the surface of all that, you need to understand that it is unified by this monistic foundation. And that's to say that those gods are not separate, autonomous beings, as you would think in terms of, say, like the Greek pantheon or the Norse pantheon or anything along those lines. They are all said to be manifestations of the one impersonal ultimate reality, which is typically called Brahman. Brahman, that is Brahman, Brahman. So Brahman in Hinduism is ultimate reality. So the metaphysical monism that makes up the metaphysic, the ontology, the nature of being in terms of Hinduism, all is one, is called Brahman. And Brahman is this impersonal, absolute, unchanging reality that lies beneath all appearances. Okay, so you see things appear a certain way, but they are manifestations of the ultimate foundation of reality, which is the ultimate one, Brahman. Okay, and it's very important. Brahman is not personal in the way Christians think of God. Okay, it's not you can't even say he. You can't say Brahman is a he or a she or anything along those lines. Whatever Brahman is, ultimate impersonal reality, okay, it is an impersonal reality, not like Christianity. Okay, and so Brahman is often described as infinite, eternal, and impersonal, pure being or pure consciousness or something along those lines. It's not, Brahman is not a being in Hindu thought, but it's being itself, if that makes sense, the ground of all being, if we can use that that philosophical kind of terminology. So think of it like this. In Hinduism, all of reality is like waves on the ocean, okay? The waves look different from one another when you're looking out on the water, right? You got big waves, you got small waves, all these different kinds of waves, right? But they're all just temporary forms of the same water. Does that make sense? And so if you think of it in terms of the analogy, Brahman is the ocean. Everything else, the gods, the world, you, me, we are just one of the waves. But the waves are part of the ocean. Okay, so differentiation, many waves, big and small, are just different manifestations of the ocean. Okay, does that make sense? So you have 330 million gods, many of them that have names and their, traditions around them and so forth, but they are just different expressions of ultimate reality, which is Brahman. So that is the Hindu metaphysic, broadly speaking. I'm sure you'll find a Hindu somewhere say, well, technically that's not quite right. And you're going to have to ask questions and so forth to get clarification. All right, so moving on, another important concept within Hinduism is the concept of the self. Okay, the concept of the self. And this brings us to the Hindu conception of what is known as Atman. Atman. Now, I'm not a fluent speaker of the folks who typically are associated with this religion, okay? So I'm not going to pretend to perfectly pronounce the words that we'll be going throughout this video. But Atman is an easy word. Hopefully I've got that right, okay? But the concept of Atman, okay, if you're interested, you're writing it down. That's Atman, Atman. Atman refers to the self, the true inner essence of a person. And here's the interesting thing. In classical Hinduism, Atman is Brahman. I'm going to say that again. In classical Hinduism, Atman is Brahman. Why? Okay, think what we talked about. What is the metaphysical foundation of Hindu thought? At least as we are expressing it here, it's a fundamental monism. If all is one, then there is no distinction between Atman, the self, and Brahman, the ultimate foundation of reality. And so that means your true self is not distinct from ultimate reality. In fact, individuality is part of the illusion of differentiation. And so your ego, your sense of being a separate I, is not ultimate. It's a temporary illusion, what Hindus typically call, it's known as Maya. Maya. And so Maya is illusion. Okay? Differentiation is illusion in a reality where ultimately everything is one thing. Okay? That's very, very important. So in Hinduism, the goal of life isn't to go to heaven, like maybe in Christianity or something. I'm not to say that that's the goal in life of Christianity, but you get what I'm saying. But that's not the goal in Hinduism. Or the goal of Hinduism is not to remain an individual forever, because individuation and individuality is illusory. The goal is to realize that your individual self is actually not real in the ultimate sense. You are Brahman. You always have been. Why? Because all is Brahman. That's the pantheistic flavor of this kind of worldview perspective. And so that is the nature of the self. Now, does every Hindu believe the exact same thing about that? You need to ask questions. What do you mean by that? What do you mean? What is your belief about Atman and Brahman and all these? You want to ask questions, okay? But there you go. Broad brush strokes. Now, the part of Hinduism that most people are familiar with, at least in popular culture, is the concept of karma. Karma. Now, how does all of this stuff play out in everyday life for the Hindu? Okay, this is where this concept of karma, which we should all be familiar with, okay, in pop culture, it's in the movies, people say all sorts of things about it. Karma is the moral law of cause and effect. Every action you perform, whether it's a good action, a bad action, whatever, produces results that shape your current, future, and experiences. So think of it like, a cosmic, concept of debt and credit. What you do now affects what you will become later. And so Hinduism also teaches the concept of reincarnation, which most people are familiar with. Your karma carries over into your next life. So if you've lived a good life, you might come back as like a higher life form. If you lived a terrible life, you have bad karma, you might return as in some kind of lower condition. Dr. Bahnsen, when he was doing critiques of Hinduism, he said that, if you have bad karma, you might come back as an aardvark or something undesirable like that, okay? But the point is, when you have good karma, you can come back as higher life form. And then if you have bad karma, you can come back as lower life form, okay? And this is kind of this never-ending loop of reincarnation called samsara. Samsara. That's Samsara, I think. Samsara. Samsara. I'll just say samsara. Okay. And samsara is the concept of the cycle of birth, death, life, birth, death, and rebirth. Sorry about that. So you have this cycle. So in Hinduism, reincarnation is not a good thing. You're trying to become liberated from the cycle. And so you have this other concept in Hinduism known as moksha. Moksha. That's Moksha for those who are taking notes. Okay. Moksha is the concept of liberation, freedom from the cycle of karma and reincarnation. And pretty much it's the final goal of life in Hinduism. But this is important. Liberation, and you got to continually contextualize these contexts because it's very easy to think about Hindu beliefs from the perspective of a Christian. Liberation in this context doesn't mean going to be with God forever like it does in Christianity, right? We are joined with Christ. When we die, to be absent from the body, we'll be present with the Lord. We believe in like a conscious existence in the presence of the Lord, and then we believe in a future bodily resurrection, so on and so forth. That's not what's going on here. In Hinduism, moksha is the realization that you are God, right? That you were never truly separate to begin with. Moksha is the dissolution of the illusion of individuality. Okay, it's an illusion. It's Maya, right? So moksha is being liberated from the illusion and the cycle. And so in moksha, and this is often the language that's used, the drop, okay, of the individual self returns to the ocean. You lose all sense of personal identity and things of differentiation, and you merge with Brahman, the ultimate metaphysical, impersonal, divine whole. All right. Now, these are very complex ideas, and the philosophy of all of this goes very deep, and there's, again, lots of nuance to this. But just generally, just in broad strokes, I hope this makes sense. Okay, it's very important to understand where someone is coming from, because then that will posture you in a way and to be in a position to kind of engage in a worldview analysis. And then, of course, you go running from there and getting deep into discussion and asking key questions and so forth. Now, why is this important? You might be thinking like, okay, Eli, this is interesting. Okay. Sounds very philosophical, right? The individuality is illusory. Right? It sounds very philosophical and deep and so forth. But why does this matter for apologetics? And again, it matters because these particular doctrines flow from a radically different metaphysical foundation than Christianity, right? There's a vast difference. Okay. We sometimes think of people as believing technically the similar stuff that we believe. People who come from kind of these Eastern perspectives are operating under a vastly different worldview perspective. And so think about it. If reality is ultimately one and all distinctions are illusory, then that's important for you to know, because a person who holds to that perspective is going to have a serious problem explaining things that are taken for granted when you are interacting with this person. Namely, they're going to have difficulty explaining things like logic, identity, even the concept of communication itself, because all of those require real distinctions, which is going to be denied from a person who holds to forms of metaphysical monism and pantheism. And that's where I think the presuppositional critique is going to be very, very useful, but we're not there yet, okay? For now, I want you just to keep this in mind. Hinduism doesn't simply offer a different view of God, it offers a different view of literally everything, okay? Of the self, of reality, of morality, of salvation, okay? And that means that we're not just dealing with a religion like some random, we're dealing with a fundamentally different worldview, one that, as you'll see, is not able to kind of hold itself up. There's vast weaknesses with it, and hopefully just by hearing what I'm saying, you can kind of figure out where I'm going to go with this. But it's important to understand a person's framework. Now, I want to reiterate this because it's super important before we kind of jump into the critique of this all. I want to slow down and I want to offer a caution, especially for those who are doing apologetics and you're interacting with folks who come from this perspective. You must understand this, and this is the case with many religious perspectives and philosophical perspectives. Hinduism is not monolithic. It is not monolithic. In other words, not all Hindus believe the exact same things. It's not a single, unified system with one sacred book or a prophet or, one official, creed or something like that, maybe like Christianity or Islam. Hinduism is better understood as a family of traditions that have developed over a very long time. So you would imagine its antiquity would lend to its diversity and nuance. So when I say things like Hindus believe in Brahman or Hindus seek moksha, I'm painting in very broad strokes. Okay, these are generalizations that really may or may not reflect the specific beliefs of the Hindu person you're actually talking to. Okay, so you need to ask questions. Very, very important. Now, because we want to engage people where they are, not just simply assume what they believe, okay, when we talk to a Hindu, you need to remember talking to a Hindu is not the same as talking to Hinduism. When you're talking to a Hindu, you're talking to a specific person, and that person might hold to, a blend of ideas from different traditions. So you're going to have to be able to make those distinctions and keep in mind nuance, okay? And this is true when people are talking about Christianity, isn't it, right? Not all Christians believe literally the same thing. Now, of course, all true Christians are going to affirm the essentials of the faith, but there are non-essentials that Christians disagree over, and there's a wide variety of views that a Christian could hold. And, we tend to get really annoyed when people don't make the proper distinctions when evaluating Christianity. Right? For example, I'm Reformed and I'm Baptistic in my theology. I'm a Calvinist. I hold to the 5 points of Calvinism. You ain't touching me in terms of critiquing me by offering critiques that are more appropriately geared towards Arminians, because I'm not an Arminian, right? I'm going to answer certain theological questions and even apologetical questions differently than an Arminian because my theology is very, very different. Now, is there similarities between Calvinism and Arminianism? Of course, yes. Okay. We might use words. For example, Arminians believe that God is sovereign. Calvinists believe that God is sovereign. But what we mean by sovereignty might be different, and those differences are important. So when we are being engaged with and critiqued as Christians, we want people to pay attention to the nuance that is involved in the various Christian perspectives. And in the same token, we want to make sure that we are making differentiation with the people that we're talking to from a Hindu perspective. So in terms of the diversity within Hinduism, let's kind of go through a quick rundown of some of the major schools or traditions within Hinduism so we can see just how diverse it actually is. Now, this is where I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. Okay, there are a lot of these. I don't know if I'm pronouncing these words correctly, but at least for our purposes, they might be useful to you. So again, let's kind of go through some of the different perspectives here. We have what is known as Advaita Vedanta. Advaita Vedanta. And this is probably the most popular, or I don't know if it's the most popular, the most famous form of Hindu philosophical monism. Advaita means not two. It teaches that there's no real distinction between Atman. What does Atman mean? I'll give you a couple of seconds. What does Atman mean? It refers to the self. And Brahman, the absolute, the metaphysical foundation of all things, right? There's no real distinction between the two, right? That's the version that we've been exploring here. The world of difference and duality is Maya. It is illusion. And salvation comes through realizing the oneness of all things. This is strict metaphysical monism. All is one. Okay, that is Advaita Vedanta. Then you have Dvaita Vedanta. Okay, I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. Dvaita Vedanta. I think I've got it. Okay, say that 5 times fast and you become Pentecostal. Sounds like you're speaking in tongues. Just kidding. So when you contrast this with the previous school, this particular school of thought teaches duality. There's a duality between the individual soul, okay, and God. According to Dvaita, I'm going to have to say that slowly, God, Vishnu in this particular system, Vishnu, is eternally distinct from the soul. And so moksha in this view is not merging with Brahman, but being with God in a kind of devotional relationship. So this version is much closer to more theistic frameworks, though obviously not a biblical perspective. So there's kind of a nuance there. Now, this one I have trouble pronouncing. This one is Vishishtadvedanta. Vishishtadvaita Vedanta. Okay. I'm going to spell it for you, okay? Because I have the outline here. It is Vishishtadvaita. Vishishtadvaita Vedanta. Okay, I hope I've got that right. All right, now this one, this particular tradition of Hinduism, this one is kind of a middle ground perspective. It means qualified non-dualism. It teaches that while everything is part of Brahman, individual selves and matter are real, and they have a sort of dependent identity. You still get union with Brahman, but not at the cost of all distinction. So there's kind of a middle perspective here. Then you have Bhakti traditions. That's much more easier to pronounce. Bhakti tradition. These are the more, devotional in nature. They tend to focus on loving devotion to a personal god like Krishna, Rama, or Shiva. And of course, Krishna, Shiva, and as mentioned in the other tradition, Vishnu, those names might be familiar to many people. But many Hindus today belong to some form of bhakti practice. And these traditions emphasize emotional connection, worship, these sorts of things. And these views can sound a little bit more monotheistic. But again, not necessarily like Christian conceptions of monotheism. All right. So there's an important distinction there. And then with many other religions, you have kind of the folk popular versions of them, kind of the more average person who's not philosophically engaged in these ideas in any technical way. You have kind of folk Hinduism. Okay. And this often is consisting of a blend of various rituals, traditions, maybe something like ancestor worship or local deities, these sorts of things. Again, these views don't kind of line up neatly with the more high philosophical, Vedantic schools of thought. Many everyday Hindus kind of engage in that more folk version of Hinduism. And again, making the differentiation is going to be important, and that's going to come down to asking questions. All right. You always want to ask the questions. Now, this is a lot. So, and you could imagine going through this in 18 minutes is impossible. Okay. I know the Bible says with God, all things are possible. I don't know if this one, if it's possible to do this in 18 minutes. I'm just kidding. But you get what I'm saying. Now, considering all of this, you might be wondering, okay, but if most Hindus aren't trained in these particular schools, maybe they come from a more popular version of it, why am I spending the time talking about monism or Advaita Vedanta, these kind of schools of thoughts? Again, it's important because even if not every Hindu consciously believes or articulates these key ideas, all right? It's the systems of thought that are going to play, they're going to play key roles in understanding where someone's coming from. The systems of thought that we've expressed here still shape the cultural and religious air many Hindus breathe. The philosophical undercurrents that influence the temple rituals and the popular sayings or the sacred text, all of these sorts of things are going to flow from this common kind of broad philosophical foundation. Okay. And so for the presuppositionalist who's approaching the Hindu, that means that we're not just trying to, get them in a gotcha moment in our interactions. It's important to understand these kind of metaphysical foundations and the distinctions and the nuances so that we're in a better position to expose their weaknesses from an internal critique perspective. All right. Because we want to be able to tear down strongholds and, of course, present the gospel. And by God's grace, obviously, we want that person to come to a knowledge of Jesus Christ. So 2 things you want to keep in mind before we kind of move forward towards with our critique. Number 1, when you're engaging with a Hindu, you want to be as accurate as possible. Don't flatten Hinduism out into like a single system. Okay. A well-informed apologist is going to honor the image of God in the person that they're speaking to by respecting where they are coming from and properly representing them, even as we engage in critique. So we want to be accurate. That is the godly thing to do. Secondly, we want to be charitable. Okay, people don't often hold to their systems consistently, but that's really a really great conversation started. It opens the door for that internal critique and a presentation of the gospel. So we want to be charitable. You might be conscious of the worldview implications and the metaphysics and the epistemology and the ethics and the interrelatedness of all these things. Not everyone thinks in those ways. And so you're going to find people who are very inconsistent. And so you want to charitably, lovingly, and respectfully navigate that discussion with that person and kindly show where those inconsistencies are. All right. So now that we have a basic understanding of Hinduism's metaphysical core and its nuanced diversity, and we've seen that while it contains many forms, many of those forms are built on the idea that ultimate reality is an impersonal oneness. You got that metaphysical monism, and that distinctions like the creator-creature within Christianity, good and evil, even the self and God within Hinduism, those distinctions are illusory in broad strokes. And that brings us to the critical question. And you might want to write this down. I might ask the question 2 times to give you time to catch up if you're taking notes. Okay, here's the question. Can a worldview built on the denial of real distinctions actually account for the very things we take for granted? Logic, meaning, morality, and truth. Can a worldview built on the denial of real distinctions actually account for the very things we take for granted? Logic, meaning, morality, and truth. And the answer to that is going to be no. Okay? Very, very important. And that's just a roundabout way of asking the same question that we ask of every single worldview. Which worldview can provide the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience? So you notice that whether you're talking about Hinduism, Mormonism, Islam, or any kind of philosophical perspective, Satanism, the occultic view, Wicca, you're asking the same questions. The only difference is the content of the discussion is going to change because people hold to different beliefs. But the undergirding philosophical questions that lay underneath all of those, they're the same questions. So like when someone says, presuppositional apologetics works really well when you're talking to the skeptic or the metaphysical naturalist or the materialist. But what about other religious perspectives? Okay. Maybe if you want to clip what I'm about to say. Okay. How do you apply the presuppositional approach to competing religious perspectives? Easy. You apply it in the same exact way you do it with the atheist. Okay. It's the same thing. There's no neutrality. There's no autonomy. And the non-Christian worldview is not going to be able to ground intelligible experience, so on and so forth. How you bring that out is going to be through the worldview analysis. Okay. So, but it's still the same kind of thing, right? We're using a transcendental principle when interacting with the unbeliever. And so we're going to ask the same kinds of questions. So I think that's important to keep in mind. So now that we've laid the groundwork for what Hinduism teaches about reality, the self, Atman, salvation, let's kind of step back and evaluate it through a presuppositional perspective. Okay, now remember what the presuppositional approach is all about. We're not comparing individual facts and evidence and isolated points. We're asking the fundamental question, and this is the transcendental question, and it is just as relevant to speaking with the Hindu as it is with speaking to the atheist. We're asking the question, what must be true in order for anything to be intelligible at all? Remember, we are examining the preconditions of intelligibility, those foundational assumptions that make knowledge, logic, morality, meaning, and intelligible experience possible to begin with. Okay, so that's the same fundamental kinds of questions that we're doing when we are discussing with the atheist. And so when we do that with the Hindu, we're doing that with Hinduism as a worldview, we discover something very interesting. And again, you could plug any worldview into what I'm about to say, and it's still relevant. If Hinduism were true, you couldn't know that it was true. Okay? That's like saying if Hinduism's true, knowledge is impossible. If atheism's true, knowledge is impossible. If Buddhism is true, knowledge is impossible. That's the same transcendental flavor, okay, that we have been following all along, regardless of whatever worldview that we are critiquing. Now, thinking in terms of monism, for that undergirding philosophical perspective of Hinduism, okay, if Hinduism is right in that regard, and ultimate reality is one, And if all distinctions are illusory, then that particular worldview in question immediately collapses under its own weight. Why? Think about it. Because knowledge depends on real distinctions. I'm going to say that again. So if you put forth a worldview that says all is one, that destroys knowledge because knowledge depends on real distinctions. If knowledge depends on real distinctions, but your metaphysic, your view of reality, destroys all distinctions, then there's a problem. If you think about it, to know something is to distinguish it from what it is not, right? To say this is true rather than that is false presupposes A is not A, that there's a real objective difference between things. But if all is one, those distinctions kind of disintegrate, they dissolve. The categories of true and false, the categories of good and evil, of self and other things, even the concepts of illusion and reality lose their meaning. Because to say something is illusion is to already presuppose the real, and if there is a distinction between the illusion and the reality, then you have distinctions, but you can't have distinctions if all is one. Okay? So if everything is ultimately the same, then the statement, everything is one, cannot be more true than its opposite, everything is not one. Both would just be temporary waves, if we can use the ocean analogy, temporary waves on the same ocean of Brahman. There's no fixed reference point for truth. And so on Hinduism, at its metaphysical root, it saws off the branch it's sitting on. It says distinctions are illusory, but that very claim depends on real distinctions in order to be meaningful in the first place. And that's what Van Til meant, okay, when Van Til speaks to this, not that he necessarily is speaking specifically to the Hindu, but this is what Van Til meant when he said that the unbeliever borrows capital from the Christian worldview. Hinduism borrows logic. Hinduism borrows coherence. Hinduism borrows identity to make its claims. But those concepts only make sense if distinctions are real. And if they're only real if reality, how can I say this? It's only real if there is a difference between the creator and the creature, okay? On Hinduism, you don't have that. And so the Hindu is going to have to assume those categories when communicating with you, but then deny those categories when he's asserting his worldview. So it is an issue of inconsistency. It is an example of the image of God bursting forth in the person's attempt to be intelligible, but then upon closer analysis, their view is unintelligible. All right. Now, if Brahman is the ultimate reality, okay, and the nature of that ultimate reality is what? We mentioned that Brahman is what? Impersonal, undifferentiated being, then personal experience, things like thought and love, become impossible at the most fundamental level. Okay, think about it. Personality requires distinction. Isn't that right? Personality requires distinction. For there to be I and thou, there must be relationship. There must be communication and difference. But if Brahman is pure, undifferentiated unity, then there can be no I or thou. There is only it. All right? And yet, here we are. Real, conscious persons, reasoning, speaking, loving, relating, so on and so forth. Our experience of personal existence is undeniable. So which worldview best explains that? Of course, the Christian worldview does. Because the God of Scripture is personal and triune. In God, remember, this is given the doctrine of the Trinity. In God, unity and diversity, right? We do not deny differentiation. We affirm it, unlike the metaphysical monist, okay? In God, unity and diversity are equally ultimate. There is one divine essence and three distinct persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, eternally relating in love. And that means a relationship from within the Christian perspective isn't illusion. It's woven into the very fabric of reality. The Trinity provides the metaphysical foundation for both unity and diversity, something Hindu monism simply can't do at a worldview level, given its metaphysic, its theory of reality. Now, Hinduism teaches that distinctions we perceive in the world are Maya, okay, as we talked about this concept of illusion before. But if the world's illusion, then the very mind perceiving that illusion must also be illusion. I'm going to say that again. If all is illusion, then the very mind perceiving that illusion must also be illusion. And if both the perceiver and the perception, if both of those things are illusion, what's left to distinguish illusion from reality? Right? I hope you see the problem there. It's self-defeating. To say the world is illusion assumes there's a real mind making a real claim about what's real and what's not. But on Hinduism, that's all swallowed up in the oneness of Brahman, okay, and the impossibility of making true distinctions. Now, Christianity, by contrast, affirms that the world is real, created by God, distinct from him, and orderly because he upholds it by his rational word. Okay, he upholds all things by the word of his power, as Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 tells us. And there's a genuine distinction between the creator and the creature, as Genesis 1:1 says, right? In the beginning, God created. There's a distinction between the creator and the creature. And that's why our senses and reasoning and so forth can actually correspond to the world. They were designed by a rational creator. So on Hinduism, knowledge is destroyed because what is dissolved is the distinction between the knower and the known and the knowing process. They dissolve into an undifferentiated oneness. Christianity grounds knowledge by affirming a rational God who made both minds and the world and so forth, and its meaningful interaction and interrelatedness. You don't have that on Hinduism. Now, if all is one, okay, notice what I'm doing. If what you say is true, here's what follows. And so I'm trying my best to do kind of a form of what we call a reductio ad absurdum, reducing a position to absurdity. So if all is one, look at what follows. If all is one, look at what follows. Well, if all is one, look at what follows. You keep going back and forth. Hopefully you see that. So if all is one, okay, take morality, okay, then moral distinctions must also be an illusion. Good and evil, right and wrong, justice and injustice, these all depend on what? Well, they depend on a real difference, right? But if there's no ultimate distinction between good and evil, then evil is just as much an expression of Brahman as the good is. And so you can't make the distinction. And will the Hindu be consistent with that in how they live their lives? I don't think they would. So pretty much that means that when we witness acts of cruelty, acts of oppression, violence, or injustice on Hinduism, we can't ultimately call those things wrong. They're just simply manifestations of the same divine reality. But again, I would appeal to the image of God at this particular point, right? Our moral experience screams otherwise. Okay, we want to press on that point because this person is made in the image of God, and we want to appeal to the image of God within them. And so when we see injustice, we know something has gone wrong. And that sense of moral oughtness only makes sense in a universe governed by a righteous personal God who distinguishes between good and evil, holiness and sin. Within Christianity, those differentiations are meaningful. Okay, the Christian worldview accounts for morality because it begins with a God whose own character is the standard of the good and whose image we bear. Monism, okay, it's got problems because what? It erases moral order by erasing the distinctions that make moral order possible to begin with. I hope you guys see the problem. Finally, when we consider Hinduism's view of salvation, moksha, liberation from cycle of rebirth by realizing your oneness with Brahman, in this particular system, salvation means losing your personal identity. Remember, the drop returns to the ocean. You cease to be a person in any meaningful sense. But in Christianity, salvation doesn't destroy personhood, does it? It redeems it. We have a doctrine of redemption. And so the gospel isn't about dissolving into God and becoming, non-being or oneness with the ground of all being or something along those lines. Christianity teaches reconciliation with God. Okay? You remain you, but you're restored. You're forgiven, glorified, and in an eternal relationship with a personal God, the God in whose image you were created. That's meaningful. And that is a very important touch point when communicating with Hindus because, that's wrapped up in the gospel, right? We're made right with God. There's a relationship with God. We are individual selves, but we are in relationship with our maker. Very, very important. So when we step back and we evaluate Hinduism presuppositionally at that worldview level, here's what we see. Okay, number one, Hinduism's metaphysical monism cannot account for logic because logic depends on real distinctions. It cannot account for morality because good and evil collapse into oneness, so the distinction is illusory. It cannot account for knowledge because the knower and the known dissolve into an illusion. The knower and the known presupposes differentiation, but on monism, the differentiation is illusion. Okay. And then lastly, it cannot account for personhood because the ultimate reality is impersonal. Okay. And so the different persons are just expressions of the ultimate impersonality. So hopefully you see the tension there. In other words, Hinduism, when you take it consistently, ends in metaphysical and epistemological gobbledygook. All right? Not so with the Christian worldview. Right? The Christian worldview is rooted in the metaphysic of the triune God who's revealed himself both in general and special revelation. He unites both unity and diversity. We can know things because knowledge presupposes categories of both unity and plurality and true distinction, so on and so forth. It is not something, these issues are not something that Christianity suffers. Okay? So when you present these issues to the Hindu, we can present the options of it is either the case that Christ is Lord, knowledge is grounded and made intelligible, or chaos, no knowledge, unintelligibility, all these sorts of things. And we present these things from a perspective of offering, the gospel, right? Either you embrace Christ and you become reconciled with God, or you continue in your rejection of Christ and you lose all meaning. And then the Hindu or the atheist or anyone else is left with living inconsistently with what they profess with their mouth, but what they believe in their heart. Okay, what they profess with their mouth is not matching what they believe in their heart of hearts. Unity, all is one, all is Brahman, but then they walk away living lives that assume what? That assumes differentiation, individuality, these sorts of things. So it's very important to push that tension. I mean, of course, we do this knowing that there is a very important distinction between proving your point to the Hindu and persuading the Hindu. And you always want to keep the Christian theology and biblical teaching in the background. The persuasion, we want to be persuasive, but we recognize that it is God who uses our words through the working of the Holy Spirit. It is a combination of both the Word and the Spirit that goes forth and produces God's sovereign result in bringing sinners into a knowledge of who He is. So we speak the truth in love, acknowledging that it is the work of God to convert the heart. This is why it's so important that we do not evaluate the success or lack thereof of our apologetics simply by looking at the results, okay? If the person rejects what you're saying, walks away, and you kind of figure, well, what was this all for? You need to always be reminded of the fact that God uses you in the evangelistic and apologetic context to work His purposes. So our job is to be content that God has used us, that we have been faithful in proclaiming and defending the gospel, and we trust God for the results. That's it. So it might be difficult to talk to someone from a Hindu perspective or an atheist perspective or some other religious perspective, but God is, I don't mean to sound cliche, but God is the God of the impossible. He is able to do the things that we think, well, how is this possibly going to work out, right? We trust God and we go, okay? We are faithful and we proclaim that truth. All right. Now, there is something I wanted to discuss, but I don't think I'm going to do it in this video. Maybe if we visit Hinduism a little bit later. Those who might be familiar with the concepts of nirvana and moksha, this concept of nirvana is often misunderstood between Hindu perspectives and Buddhist perspective. If you take the religion of Buddhism, there is a conception of nirvana, and people often will confuse those concepts between Hinduism and Buddhism, if that makes sense. But I will leave that for another time. All right, well, I hope that this all makes sense. Okay, it's a lot of information, but it's super interesting. There is, what book did I purchase? I think I ordered it on Audible. I think it's called Hinduism, A Very Brief Introduction. I think it's part of the Very Brief Introduction. Let me get the actual title here. What was the name of the book? If someone's interested in studying this in a little bit more detail. So if I go to my Audible app, that's where I downloaded it. It is called Hinduism, A Very Short Introduction. Highly recommend those book series. I just recently got a bunch of different books in that series. I got Hinduism, A Very Short Introduction. I've got Aristotle, A Very Short Introduction. Plato, A Very Short Introduction. Philosophy of Science, A Very Short Introduction. Logic, A Very Short Introduction. So I like the series. They're little books that cover big, important ideas. So highly recommended if you're interested in studying Hinduism. They've got a Hinduism one. You can check it out. All right. Well, interestingly enough, after coming back from this conference, I just came back. What's today? Today, right now, is Monday. I came back Sunday. Yeah, I came back yesterday, and my schedule is cleared. I don't have any speaking engagements from now until February, and that's going to be my debate with Dan Barker in Dallas, Texas, over there with Marlon Wilson putting on the Gospel Truth debate conference, which is going to be insane because obviously I'm not the only one doing debates. There's going to be a whole bunch of people doing debates, so I'm super, super excited being there to watch other debates, people who will very likely be better debaters than myself, but I'm looking forward to doing my first debate and also watching other people who do it far better than myself. So that's going to be super exciting. So my schedule has lightened up and I'm able to kind of do a little bit more in-depth studying and so forth. I'll also be hopping on to some other channels in the future. I think I'll be doing another interview on Apologetics 315. Hopefully we'll do that soon. I've got to pick a date as I'm thinking out loud. So we can nail that down on the calendar. But other than that, if you want to connect with me or you want me to speak at your conference or your event or your church, as I've said in past videos, that is totally a thing. You can reach out to me at revealedapologetics@gmail.com. You could email me and you can go on to my website, revealedapologetics.com. And there is literally a little window there on the home screen where you can fill out and I'll get the message automatically. That's primarily how people invite me to events and things like that. If you don't want to invite me anywhere and you're just saying, hey, I just like your content, man, well, thank you so much. If you listen to me on iTunes, what's really helpful is you go over to iTunes and you write a positive review. So far, we are doing really good as a podcast. I've just been very blessed with all of the positive feedback. People are finding the content very, very useful. And that's just such a blessing to me. I'm very, very grateful for that. Well, that's it. Okay. I guess I'm not sure. I'm always try to remember, is there something else I have to share? I think that's it for now. But, anyway, well, guys, thank you so much. I really do appreciate if you've lasted this long all the way at the end of this video. Be sure to like the video. This is all super helpful to us folks on YouTube. Share the video. Use it as a teaching tool, grab clips and share it. You can do all of that stuff. I don't mind at all and highly encourage it. All right. Well, until next time, guys, take care and God bless. Bye-bye.